Hey there, Altenew friends, welcome back to another perfect pairing with me. In September 2024, Altenew released this Build a Garden Alluring Orchids as part of the Build a Garden subscription. Let's create a jewel-toned Phalaenopsis orchid that uses Altenew's new Crafty Necessities cardstocks. Before we get into today's project, make sure you subscribe to the Altenew channel for more card making and paper crafting tutorials. My Perfect Pairings with JC series explores crafting techniques that effortlessly blend sure-to-love new releases and well-loved Altenew favorites. If you love these kinds of crafty tutorials, hit the bell icon so you'll be notified of my videos airing on the 2nd and 4th Sunday. On August 25th, 2024, I showcased the Crafty Necessities cardstocks and gorgeous ways to create ink-blended florals. I used some well-loved Altenew favorites in that video, but wanted to show newer florals with darker blooms. I used Altenew's Build-A-Garden Alluring Orchids and the coordinating add-on die set. So this die set does not normally come with the Build-A-Garden subscription, but you'll get absolutely stunning results if you supplement the Build-A-Garden with the add-on die bundle. In my stamp wheel, I have the black SlimGrip mat. I'll use the mat to hold a cut A2 panel of Caribbean Sky Crafty Necessities cardstock. I'm using the top left corner as my reference point for my cardstock. Then I'll place the Alluring Orchid outline stamp on this Caribbean Sky cardstock. I'm planning for a little overhang with this orchid spike on my card front. To stamp the outline, I'm using Persian Blue from Glacier Cave's Fresh Dye ink set. This is the same family of inks as the Caribbean Sky cardstock. I'm going to keep this outline stamp on my stamp wheel flip plate because I'll need to re-stamp the outline later. For now, I'm going to remove the stamped cardstock from my stamp wheel and SlimGrip mat and transfer the cardstock to an Altenew sticky mat. With the Alluring Orchids coordinating stencils, I'll begin shading and coloring my orchids. I'm basing my orchid coloring off of a blue-violet Phalaenopsis orchid, commonly available at the grocery store or home improvement store. Blue orchids are not natural, nor are they rare finds. They're made by injecting a food-grade water-based dye into the stem of the orchid. This way, the orchid takes in the dye to the leaves, stems, and petals. I had one of these a few years ago, which has since reverted to its original white flower base and purple freckles. I'm going in chronological order with the stencils, and this cloud white pigment ink is going to be what elevates the design of the orchids. I have dedicated a mini ink blending brush to the cloud white pigment ink pad. And just like watercolor, I'm starting with the lightest ink and moving to the darkest for each petal layer. I'm concentrating more of this color on the petal and sepal tips and diffusing the pigment ink more than halfway down the petal to the flower center. I'll do that for all the visible layers on the number 1 stencil. Before I start adding in the darker layers of ink, I'm going to use a barely moistened paper towel to wipe the excess pigment ink from around the stencil. Then I'll start adding in the next layers of fresh dye ink. I'm using the same Persian Blue fresh dye ink from earlier and a different mini ink blending tool to deepen the flower layers. This time I'm concentrating more of the color in the center of the flower and diffusing the ink toward the cloud white pigment ink. I'm using a paper towel to brush off some of the cloud white pigment ink I pick up while ink blending before returning my ink blending brush to the fresh dye ink pad. This is just to avoid too much carryover between the inks. Then once I feel I have an adequate transition between cloud white and Persian blue, then I'll deepen the layer with Indigo Sky's fresh dye ink. Again, I'm using the paper towel after ink blending and before returning the brush to my fresh dye ink pad to avoid too much carryover to my ink pads. Here's the reveal of the first stencil layer. I'll move on to the second stencil layer. This layer is just like the first, which fills in a base color of the orchid sepals and petals. I'll quickly go through the coloring again. I'm starting with Cloud White pigment ink on the tips of the flowers. Then I'll wipe the stencil to remove the excess pigment ink. I'll create an initial gradient of Persian blue fresh dye ink and wipe my ink blending tool before returning the brush to the ink pad. Then I'll deepen the petal layers with Indigo Skies fresh dye ink. It might help to keep the stamp set outline close by as reference to make sure that your white to blue gradients match for each orchid flower. It might get difficult to tell which petals belong to which flower otherwise. Here is the result of the first two stencil layers. The third stencil layer creates this cupped detail layer and features outline etching to ensure this layer is aligned perfectly. I'm using ultraviolet fresh dye ink from Enchanted Garden fresh dye ink set to make this deep detail layer for my blue orchids. We will move on to the stems, labellum, and column of the orchid flower on the subsequent stencils. On the number 4 stencil is the labellum layer and the stem. I'll start with another layer of Cloud White pigment ink concentrated on the outer perimeter of the labellum. My second layer of ink will come from ultraviolet. Just as before, I wiped off the excess Cloud White pigment ink before applying ultraviolet fresh dye ink, and I'll wipe off my brush every time before picking up more ink from the pad. Then finally, I'll use Purple Wine fresh dye ink from the Rose Petal fresh dye ink set to separate the labellum from the petals and sepals of the flower. To color the stem layer, I used Mangrove Root fresh dye ink simply because it was a green ink within reach at the time. Then finally, with the number 5 stencil, I'll add layers of Purple Wine to the orchid column. I made a little boo-boo here. I was just ink blending away, but I'll conceal that. And then on the other half of the number 5 stencil, I'll add ultraviolet. In the stamp set are layers A8 and A9. You can choose to leave these out if you wish, but I love the freckling of the labellum. This is exactly how my blue orchid looked before it lost its blue blooms and reverted to white. I'm aligning these stamp layers to their respective orchids. Then I'll pick up the stamps in my stamp wheel using the opposite side of the outline stamp that remains on my flip plate. I'm using Cosmic Berry to color the speckles on the labellum. Speaking of the outline stamp, now we can stamp over the stenciled image and enhance the outline of the original image. Initially, I used Persian blue just as I did at first, but then changed my mind to Indigo Skies to get a more outstanding and obvious outline to the image and contrast the white petal tips. Since I'll be die cutting this orchid image, I'm going to use the negative areas of the Caribbean Sky cardstock to stamp my hello sentiment with Cosmic Berry fresh dye ink. I'll set this aside before die cutting to let the Cloud White's pigment ink dry and move on to the background of this card. I'm starting with another panel of Caribbean Sky cardstock, and using my sticky matte grid and a large ink blending brush, I'll apply a gradient of Persian blue fresh dye ink. Then Indigo Skies fresh dye ink. I think ink blending background gradients on colored cardstock just like this is such a professional and elegant look, but I'll take this up one more level by adding an embossing folder. I was looking for a tight geometric pattern embossing folder in my Altenew stash. I found that this Hexagon Blocks 3D geometric embossing folder was going to be perfect for this background. It kind of reminds me of a perfume bottle. Then once I have my background glued to a folded note card base, I'll use the add-on Alluring Orchids die set to cut out the ink blended image. Alluding to the video I shared on August 25th, I love how ink blending on colored cardstock and matching it to the background color looks sophisticated and polished. Nothing is wrong with a white offset die cut, but when it comes to deeper palettes, matching the die cut element to the background gives a perfect quality. To finish this card, I'll add a lot of pure white ink spray splatter, just to match the soft glow of the cloud white pigment ink petals, and to also conceal my over ink blending. Then I'll foam mount a stacked die cut hello sentiment next to the orchid arrangement. Finally, I'll finish this card with dried petals enamel dots. This Build-A-Garden Alluring Orchids has easily become one of my favorites from this year's release. Here's a second version I made for my blog featuring a crimson cardstock base and no geometric background. Let me know which one you prefer in the comments. My series encourages you to shop your existing Altenew stash and rekindle their love with newer releases. Perfect Pairings with JC airs on the Altenew channel every second and fourth Sunday of the month. Please make sure you like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you so much for tuning in to this perfect pairing episode with me, and I'll see you in the next one.
Hey there, Lydia here. I really do hope that you've just enjoyed the video. If so, please subscribe to the Altenew YouTube channel. Also, turn on the notification bell so you can get your daily dose of crafty techniques and tutorials just like this. Thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.